Let's try to start and see what happens.
I've only got one of these. I'd offer it to you, but I'm losing my voice.
Thank you, thank you. No, I'm... Okay, so we have some logistical problems, but anyway, the situation is that people came, and very grateful for you to come at this late hour. Also, given the fact that there is a reception there with beer, I don't want to spoil your mood any further. So this is an event organized by UN Oceans. Actually, the whole thing here these 2 weeks is organized by United Nations, because it's United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we are addressing one of the nexuses there, the nexus on ocean, what we do for the ocean. And we are going to have a statement made by Valentina Germani about the UN Oceans and what they do for climate change. And I think in the statement there will be some introduction to what UN Oceans is, and I hope very much that this set of organizations that really care about the ocean, have ocean in their mandate, will do more and better, and will be very successful in addressing the challenge that Peter Thomson so eloquently formulated. We need to save the ocean, we need action now. So without any additional delay, I would like to give the floor to Valentina Germani, who is representing here Department of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea.
Thank you very much, and good evening. And again, thanks for being here. It's a late night. It's been a long ocean day, so thank you for joining us at this event. It's with great pleasure that I will deliver a statement on behalf of Mr. Miguel de Serpa Soares, the United Nations Legal Counsel and the UN Ocean Focal Point. At the outset, I wish to recall that UN Oceans is the interagency cooperation and coordination mechanism for oceans and coastal issues of the United Nations system. It plays an essential coordination role within the United Nations system and stands ready to work with member states and all relevant stakeholders in support of efforts to address the impacts of climate change on the oceans. UN Oceans members are actively involved in a number of activities aimed at assisting and building the capacity of states to adapt to the impact of climate change on the oceans, as well as ocean acidification, as well as to achieve mitigation goals in the context of ocean activities. I wish to take this opportunity to note with appreciation that a number of the UN Oceans members are represented in this room, including on this panel, and they will provide information about their activities. The international community is increasingly focusing on the adverse impacts of climate change and related changes in the atmosphere on oceans, as well as the interlinkages between ocean processes and climate regulation. This was very well demonstrated today during this event, long event. These impacts and interconnections have extensively been reported, in particular by the IPCC, and also in the first global integrated marine assessment of the regular process for global reporting and assessment of the state of the marine environment, including socioeconomic aspect. The World Oceans Assessment, which was the result of that process, was released in December 2015. In addition, I wish to bring to your attention that the group of experts of the regular process also prepared a technical abstract on the theme of the effects of climate change on oceans. The abstract is based on the relevant information provided in the World Ocean Assessment, and it's catered to the needs of the UNFCCC. I have a few copies of that abstract with me, and it's also available on our website. As you know, the impacts of climate change on ocean will be further explored by the IPCC, but also in the second cycle of the World Ocean Assessment. So more science will be gathered in the years ahead. What's increasingly clear is that the direct and indirect impacts of climate change on ocean and coastal ecosystems, such as ocean warming, sea level rise, ocean acidification, deoxygenation, and all those impacts that we are aware, not only affect the environment, but also produce significant socioeconomic consequences for all states. These include loss of life, displacement of communities, loss of territory, destruction of property, decline of regional shifts in fish stocks, coral bleaching, and other ecosystem degradation. In addition, we also know that oceans are a major sink of carbon dioxide, which has benefited humankind by significantly reducing greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. Excellencies, distinguished participants, at the intergovernmental policymaking level, starting in 2006 already, the UN General Assembly, in its annual resolutions on oceans and law of the sea, has continued to draw attention to the needs to address the impacts of climate change and ocean acidification on marine ecosystems. It has encouraged states to enhance scientific activity and support marine scientific research to better understand the impacts of climate change and develop ways and means of adaptation. It has also further called for enhanced international cooperation and capacity building to support research activities. In addition, the General Assembly mandated this year's meeting of the Informal Consultative process. In short, it's a much longer title, but we will cut that. This meeting was held in May 2017, and it focused its discussion on the effects of climate change on ocean. This was the first time that these issues of global concern and all its environmental, social, and economic implications were discussed by an intergovernmental forum in a cross-sectoral manner. So there's been already a lot of work done to try and link in a cross-sectoral way oceans and climate. Recognizing these challenges, delegations at the Informal Consultative process stressed the negative impacts of climate change on oceans, which pose significant threats to the efforts of all states, in particular developing countries, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and targets in accordance with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Cooperation across sector was considered essential in order to ensure a timely response to disaster and weather-related hazards. In the context of the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the commitments under the UNFCCC, it was noted that the effective implementation of UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and related instruments would contribute to building resilience and enhancing ocean-based adaptation and mitigation. It was also recognized that enhancing the synergies between the oceans and climate change regimes would support efforts to attain other relevant goals and targets, including the SDGs, the Samoa Pathway, the Aichi Biodiversity Targets, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, as well as other sector-based efforts. It is also important to recall that earlier this year, the call for action adopted at the UN Ocean Conference on the implementation of the SDG 14, states expressed particular alarm about the adverse impacts of climate change on ocean. They acknowledged the need to address the impact that impair the crucial ability of the oceans to act as climate regulator, as a source of marine biodiversity, and as key provider of food and nutrition, tourism and ecosystem services, and as an engine for sustainable economic development and growth. Because healthy oceans are one of the components underpinning the success and action under the Paris Agreement, as called for in the call for action, it will be incumbent on us, the United Nations family, states, and our partners working in multiple disciplines to coordinate our efforts to develop and implement effective adaptation and mitigation measures that contribute to increasing and supporting the resilience to oceans and coastal acidification, sea level rise, and the other threats of climate change. This will not only promote the implementation of relevant obligations and commitments under the UNFCCC framework, it will also promote the effective implementation of UNCLOS and the relating instruments. To conclude, I would like to wish you all success in your work and ongoing deliberations at the session, and to assure you of the full support of UN Ocean members, including through its focal point, Mr. Miguel da Serpa Soares, and the Division for Ocean Affairs and the Law of the Sea. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I would like to state that what we do is determined by the needs, like science, like issues that are on us. But how we do is basically dictated by a convention that we have, Convention of Law of the Sea, and it's the role of DOA laws to look that we do it in the correct way. So I would like then continue and turn now to the topic of the ocean acidification. The person who is now approaching the scene is actually a technical secretary of the Global Ocean Acidification Network. In IOC, we're going to host the secretariat, Kirsten Eisensee. But I would like to give the floor to Peter Swarzensky, working for International Atomic Energy Agency. Actually, this agency is doing fantastic work on science of ocean acidification and methods to detect it. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It gives me great honor to share the stage with so many sister organizations in the UN. What I'm going to do in my 5 or 6 minutes is just give you a few examples on how the IAEA and its collaborating, its other collaboration with UN organizations is acting on ocean acidification. So by now, you all, I'm sure, have seen renditions of this graph. And I wanted to put this up mostly to show you the really nice evidence that climate and oceans are indeed interrelated. And this is a couple of articles that came out just recently, just a few weeks ago. The surge in CO2 concentrations has been tied also to El Nino as well as human activity. So very nice evidence that El Nino cycles appear to have an exasperating effect on the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. The next slide is something that the BBC just released. This is a NASA report on CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And I have a short movie that I wanted to show you, just some snippets of this, because I think it really nicely shows how complex the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are over a temporal scale. So I think we're going to start in early winter and go through July. This was an article that was released just a few days ago. One of the things that's amazing here is you can see the plume of CO2 seems to max out at around 10 kilometers, but you can see the incredible complexities in the structure of the CO2 on this temporal scale. And we all know that the ocean takes up 25 or 30% depending on where you are. And so what I want to do with the next few slides and to show how the CO2 gets incorporated below the waterline and how it impacts some very important fundamental processes. I think the last image here is just the contrast between July and then March. So as scientists, as we're trying to make these linkages between the atmosphere and the ocean, you can see how incredibly complicated this is, and drives home the point that we need interdisciplinary large time series data sets that allow us to unravel these complexities. So now we're going to move below the surface of the water. We all know that the ocean acidification has great impacts to marine life, to the building blocks of biology in the ocean. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but just the first two bullets here, 40% increase in CO2 since the industrial period, and the pH drop of 26%. If our bodies have a pH drop of just 5%, they would be fatal. And we all know that some very important commercial organisms are affected. These can range from mollusks to crustaceans, finfish, and corals. They're variably affected, as has been shown over the last couple of days. Mollusks, for example, are are most affected, as are corals. In terms of the commercial asset, mollusks are around 24 billion per year, and corals are 365 billion per year. If you augment the effects of ocean acidification with other stressors, such as, for example, deoxygenation or temperature or human perturbations, we are already seeing fundamental changes in these shifts in marine ecosystems. So what is IEA's role in OA? Specifically in SDG 14.3, this in collaboration with IOC and other UN organizations, we do two things foremost. We promote and conduct science, and I'm going to give you a few examples of that, and then we support and promote global platforms on OA. And the two examples I'm going to show are IEA's Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center and GOA. So I have the difficult task of only showing one slide on the science of this, but in Monaco we have these fantastic laboratories where we can very carefully regulate the pH or the CO2 or the dissolved oxygen concentration, and then can mimic an ecosystem either from the tropics to the Arctic, and we can very carefully assess the effects of these multiple stressors on marine organisms and on trophic food webs. And in this instance, I'm just showing the effects of using calcium-45 as one isotope that allows us to look at calcification rates on commercially relevant marine species. On the bottom right-hand side, I show the isotopic signature of boron, for example, in a coral core or in a sediment core that allows us to reconstruct pH profiles back in time that might provide some boundaries for how the pH might have fluctuated as we project into the future. So I mentioned the Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center. This is a project run out of Monaco. It's now in its second iteration, and it has three main functions. It disseminates, it communicates OA news, it builds capacity and informs capacity to member states, and it conducts science. So with those three main hubs, if you are interested in more information, there's lots of information on the web, and I'm more than happy to share that with you later. I have a one-slide summary of the Go On. This is a relatively new network that was started in 2012. I think there's more than 60 member states that have already joined, and is rapidly growing. There are kind of three main cruxes to Go On. The first one is to document the status and progress of ocean acidification. The second one is to understand the impacts of OA on diverse marine ecosystems. And the last one is to support forecasts so we can then make projections into the future. One of the nice things about Go On is that there is a very user-friendly, informative portal that allows you access into OA data and other web-based tools, and I show that in the upper left panel. The other thing that the IEA does I think very well is it has this technical cooperation program that builds capacity in member states around the world. And in regards to ocean acidification, we have an interregional OA project. To date, more than 40 countries have signed into this interregional project and are all starting to speak the same language about how to build projects around OA. So just to wrap up, in terms of future needs, we definitely need to do more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary science that allows us to look at the effects of ocean acidification in the context of physical oceanography, in the context of biogeochemical change, in the context of climate change. And this type of information over different timescales is going to allow us to build more robust global networks that will then allow us to make accurate assessments. And all of this is within SGD 14, and specifically in 14.3, the minimizing impacts of OA. And this is, as was mentioned, the direct charge for the IOC. So with that, I'll end it.
Thank you very much, Peter. And now we will move to one ecosystem that suffers really strongly from ocean acidification. And Fanny Duvier from UNESCO from the World Heritage Center will present to you the work on this subject.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I have a presentation prepared, but since we only have 7 minutes, I'll share a few points with you because I think World Heritage is very well known. It has a very global brand recognition, but it's mostly known for cultural places. It's the places where we love to go on holiday, typically, and we don't necessarily associate World Heritage with the oceans. Yet, since 1982, when the Great Barrier Reef of Australia was inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List, we have grown into a global network of 49 marine protected areas, iconic marine protected areas, in 37 different countries. Now, today, when you look at that collection of sites, that collection of protected areas that are globally outstanding and unique in terms of their biodiversity, their ecosystems, they cover approximately 10% of by surface area of everything that is protected in the oceans. So when we look today at the World Heritage Convention, it is actually one of the few instruments that is globally ratified. It's a convention that is now, at least in we're missing 3 very small countries with whom we're working, meaning it's globally ratified. And it's a convention, probably the only convention when it comes to ocean conservation, that has the capability and the mandate to hold nations accountable for the kind of actions they are taking in particular places. What we're doing, again, the brand is very well known, but what we are doing as UNESCO World Heritage in collaboration with our advisory bodies is to oversee and monitoring the state of conservation of every one of those sites on a permanent basis. Once a site gets inscribed on the World Heritage List, it obviously gets that recognition for being something unique and exceptional. But what very few people realize and know is that from that very moment, every country takes up the responsibility to protect a place. And we, again, in collaboration with our advisory bodies, officially every year review those particular World Heritage sites. Now, conditions, for example, for not maintaining the special characteristics, in this case, the special ocean characteristics of these places, means that we have the authority and the possibility to inscribe sites on UNESCO's World Heritage List in danger, or in fact, to delist sites from the list altogether. Now, I think what I wanted to share with you, and I very much appreciate the opportunity for doing this in this session, is that perhaps we have been overlooking to some extent the World Heritage Convention when it comes to reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, and in this particular case, Sustainable Development Goal 14, because once again, when 49 exceptional and unique ocean places in 37 different countries cover by surface area about 10% of everything that is protected, it does, if we do invest in those places, it does allow a very substantial move forward in reaching those particular goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, but obviously also the IAEA targets under the CBD that called for a very specific percentage by 2020, which is less than 3 years ago, 3 years ahead of us, sorry. So I wanted to share that point. Now, the reason why we are here at the climate conference is because all of our actions obviously are geared towards building resilience, because every single recommendation we make, every single topic we are working on with particular countries in those particular sites are to reduce pressures that are there, whether it's illegal fishing or legal fishing, whether it's addressing pollution, tourism, anything. It is our entire system with the World Heritage Convention is geared towards building resilience by reducing other pressures. Now, unfortunately, this year we have obviously, as I think many of you know, have dealt with some very substantial losses in World Heritage sites, namely especially the Great Barrier Reef of Australia, and it made us look more across the board, all of these sites, what climate change actually meant. And I'll just run for a few minutes through some of the key conclusions. Today, the World Heritage List among those 49 includes 29 coral reef systems. Again, it's places such as the Great Barrier Reef, but also Phoenix Islands and Kiribati, or the lagoons of New Caledonia in France. And over the last 3 decades, and since the 1980s, we have seen 3 major mass coral bleachings. So what we did is to use satellite data from NOAA's Coral Reef Watch to see what the effects have been on those sites and what the future is going to look like for them. And it is a very fairly sad story, and I think it's a bit of an early warning kind of message of what is coming ahead of us in a very specific way. Because I think it's important to realize that a lot of these places, a lot of these World Heritage sites are typically places that are better protected perhaps than some of the other marine protected areas. So I think if you look what's happening here, it is a clear message for what's happening elsewhere. Nearly half of all the World Heritage listed coral reefs has experienced very severe bleaching at least twice a decade over the last 3 centuries. Now, when we then looked at the projections for the future, we modeled 2 projections. We modeled the UNFCCC RCP 8.5 and the RCP 4.5. And the 8.5, as many of you know, is the, quote, business as usual scenario. We saw that basically 25 out of the 29 coral reef systems would severely bleach twice a year by 2040. Now, what that basically means is that when that accelerates, and when you see that over the course till the end of the century, is that they would actually start bleaching annually quite severely, meaning that they would not have the capability anymore to rebound. So I wanted to share this message with you because for us, again, as World Heritage, and I mean us, but I mean really everybody, because World Heritage sites, they are listed on the World Heritage list for their outstanding universal value, and as our common heritage of humanity, what the message really here is that local management and what we're doing locally and all the investment we're making is far not enough anymore in order to actually deal with this thing. So we need to shift our attention quite rapidly in terms of reducing emissions if we are going to have any chance of protecting some of these places. So that's about what I wanted to share. I thank you for your attention, and I'm open for any questions after this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fanny. You know, and this is just an example of an ecosystem that is really suffering because coral reefs live at the limit of the bearing capacity when it comes to temperature. But of course, we need to invent science solutions for management of ecosystems, and corals also can be managed. But we need to speak about management of ecosystem on a global perspective. And this is an organization, the United Nations Environment, is basically responsible for this. The person in the United Nations Environment who is responsible for this is Lisa Svensson. So I would like to give the floor to Lisa to introduce this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. And I also wanted to refer in the beginning of the Fiji representative when we talk about ocean and climate change. And I think at least we struggle a bit. What could we actually do to make these linkages between ocean and climate change? And it hasn't really been that easy, because if you work in a government, the climate change negotiators is so focused on the climate change and the climate, and the ocean has been really separated as a totally different subject. And it's, we have to say also, very different people working with the different areas. And that's, I guess, for most of the sectors involving the oceans. But to refer to the Fijian, I think that's as a part of this ocean partnership pathway that we might hear more about from UN envoy. He mentioned 4 particular issues, and that was the ocean energy and the offshore ocean energy. And the second one was blue carbon as a specific ocean action item to bring into the climate change agenda. And the third one was climate resilience and the fisheries. And then, of course, the fourth one is to find the insights on the investment in the blue economy as such. And I think that's a very core message that we should remind ourselves. So we're looking into the blue carbon, and obviously coral reef, as we heard Fanny talk about, is part of the blue carbon. And I think when we talk about the blue carbon, we have to remind ourselves that it is an ecosystem-based mitigation tool or a solution, which is a pure case for the blue carbon. And blue carbon is stored in the sediment, and if we free that up, if we free this carbon sink up, there is of course freeing up also a lot of emissions contributing to the climate change. And we have 2 examples that I wanted to just mention to you. At the same time, I also wanted to point out that we do have an expert in the audience, who is Stephen right here. Maybe you want to wave your hand. And Stephen is an expert at blue carbon, and we work very closely with the Grid Arendal, which is competence center of the UN Environment. So I'm not going to go into the details of the two cases, but Steve is here, and he would be happy to answer any specific questions on that. On the Indonesian case, which is one of the cases that we have, is to address the knowledge gap. What is blue carbon? And educate and address the literacy. How does the blue carbon matters? Why does it matter? And how does it link into the climate change? And what could also it contribute to the local communities? How can it be sort of contributing to the sustainable development in those local communities? And we are engaging with the UNFCCC on the International Partnership on Blue Carbon. So there is something that we are currently going on, and we could strengthen this work much more clearly, so it also becomes a part of the national determination, the NDCs for the countries on a national level. So the lessons learned from Indonesia could, of course, be scaled up on a global level. So we have toolkit, best practice, to really have a core case to talk about what you mean by blue carbon. And the next case is a community, what we call community benefit. It's from Kenya, where UN Environment is located. And we're working, as you can say, with the local communities. And it's getting payment to save or to restore or to conserve the blue carbon. And in one of those areas, it's called Mikoko Pomoya. And the money that has been spent or has been put into the blue carbon has actually supported clean waters for 4,500 communities, 700 school children, and a lot of mangrove areas for mangroves. So the money and the investment could actually be used for the local community. And that change and that drive the local community's engagement in also seeing the value of protecting the natural habitat that they do have. And just to mention that finance project was financed also by the GEF, and it received the UN Environment Innovation Prize in 2017. And this is also something that we will take 15 journalists, including BBC, in connection to the United Nations Environment Assembly in Nairobi in December. We will go with them out and show them really that this is a specific project that we want to highlight as a part. So you talk about the local blue carbon, local communities, but if you link it in to what we're trying to do with the whole climate change agenda and the importance of ocean, you have a story to tell to hopefully the journalists. And it also gives them an education as we educate ourselves and the local community. We also need to educate and engage with the media. So having said that, the nature-based solutions for the local communities, I guess it's a catchphrase to bring up in this sense. And we heard Fanny, of course, with the coral reef as a part of also blue carbon. And we also heard the tremendous, the critical phase that the coral reef is currently facing or has been facing during the last years. And next year is the coral reef year. And we will step up our engagement with all partners relevant, particularly in the UN Oceans, under the umbrella of the UN Envoy for Ocean, and defining solutions and roll out a big campaign on coral reef. I just threw that out there, and we're happy to engage, and obviously Peter Thomson will bring up that later on. I guess the last three key messages to wrap up is that blue carbon could really be an element for sustainable blue economy, which is afterwards something that we talk about, what is blue economy and how does it affect ocean? So financing investment in carbon could really contribute and be a foundation for a sustainable blue economy. And I guess it's the same logic or the same method that the value of the fish has a greater value in the ocean rather than the market. So it's the same logic. Second one is that innovative nature-based solutions, of course, putting a value on the nature capital. And the third one, I guess, is, of course, a partnership. We can definitely not do this alone as a UN environment. We need to have both the local, the regional, the national, the global level. And we also need to have the private sector for driving the investment, the NGOs, the local NGOs that often have the knowledge and the competence of the actually local community that we do not have the capacity to do, of course, all over the world. And obviously, did I forget someone? The media, to bring up the message. And of course, the scientist and the science-based decision is a foundation for everything we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And now I would like to give the floor to Dion Blanche, who is representing the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations voice on weather, water, and climate. And we really do together a lot when it comes to ocean activities.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the way forward for improving the collaboration between the atmospheric and ocean greenhouse gas community. So this is something very specific. But before we get there, and it's been a long day, I would like to share a little story with you, because sometimes a story really makes an impression. And I will read you the story about this dance between the oceans and the atmosphere. They have danced for millions of years to the rhythm of the sun and the moon. Neptune the strong and Chaos the wild. Their dances color-coordinated, waltzes in white and ballads in blue. At times it's fast, at times just mild. Together at sunset they flow and ebb. Touch and kiss, a slow dance in red. Sometimes they fight in shades of grey. You hear the quarrel, feel the winds, see the tears. She temperamentally violent, he's slow to forget and forgive. Yet it always blows over, joined together they stay. Even when we try to break this bond, interrupt the dance, they keep dancing together, painfully closer, whatever we play. So I think this is a story that tells us how intimate this relation between the oceans and the atmosphere really is. The WMO has this routine of launching the Greenhouse Gas Bulletin every year just before this event to provide some scientific background to the discussions. And a few years ago, we highlighted in this bulletin with the partners around the table here also the linkages with ocean acidification, so that as we see the greenhouse gases and specifically CO2 rise in the atmosphere, what is happening in the oceans as well. In another example, we've shown how the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere offsets what we emit in the atmosphere. And so this is a consistent story that we all need to tell, is that the dance just continues. And this year's Greenhouse Gas Bulletin highlighted the new record, but not only that, it compared the rate of change with the rate that we've seen in the past. And we have never seen this rate of change in the atmospheric CO2 concentrations for tens of thousands of years. So this is the graph that shows that greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise, especially on the left-hand side, we see CO2. But more than that, we see below that also the growth rate. And what is worrying is that the growth rate in the atmosphere continues to grow as well. So the change is happening faster and faster. Despite the optimism that we hear that emissions are maybe peaking out, we must remember that CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So it's a complex system, and in this graph we can again see how the ocean plays a very important role in this carbon cycle. I will not go into detail, but I would like to show you also, just mention something, a new initiative by the WMO called the Integrated Global Greenhouse Gas Information System that can assist in the future the bottom-up measurements or the IPCC reporting on emissions by doing measurements in the atmosphere and using sophisticated inverse modeling to add additional value so that we can reduce the uncertainties. And this is also very important for this relationship between the oceans and the atmosphere, because this technology can also give us better insights in where the things actually happen and how they change in time. So we have a potential collaboration between these two communities. They basically use the same type of instruments to do the measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere and in the ocean, but there are some critical differences on how they use this equipment. And WMO, through the Global Atmosphere Watch program, has a long history of setting global standards with one reference globally. So there's definitely an opportunity to cooperate. And we have started there because we have a routine meeting of the greenhouse gas measurement techniques people, and we have now also invited the ocean community. This has also been sponsored by my good friend next door, IAEA. This get-together. So what should we pursue? So increase sites that conduct high-quality atmospheric and ocean CO2 measurements. And maybe we've heard about the Unesco Heritage Center and the sites that we have around the world. Maybe that's the ideal places to shed even more light on this and also underscore the importance of these communities to work together. So that is maybe a win-win situation for all of us. And then close cooperation between all the role players involved towards harmonized CO2 data in the atmosphere and the ocean, and making sure that these data are accessible to researchers and other users. So data discovery with metadata that describes the quality and where it's situated is really important. And then, of course, we need to have a unified message within the UN family regarding this closely linked atmosphere-ocean dance that will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dion. Indeed, there is this struggle to really work with emissions, to see what is happening with carbon. And this struggle is very strong in the domain of shipping. And in International Maritime Organization, which is represented here by José Mateical, is actually spearheading the work on reducing carbon emissions from shipping. But shipping transports 90% of goods between countries, so it's really a difficult task. So, José, you have your 5-7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for staying back. Just heard from the chairman about the greenhouse gas emission from study from the maritime sector. I don't think you need much of introduction. There were so many side events that talked about shipping and emission in this last few days, and next week also, I think there are a few more sessions on shipping emissions. But that summarizes the reason why IMO is taking actions. There is a potential for a between 50 to 250% increase in the GHG emission from shipping if nothing is done. And that's the main driver why IMO is acting on it. Yes, IMO did act, and the IMO community came up with the first mandatory global regulation on GHG emissions by regulating shipping a few years back. The Annex 6 to the MARPOL was added that dealt with the energy efficiency, the Chapter 4. So there was a significant move, and there was the first time globally an industry was mandated to address emissions. And those requirements is expected to reduce the emissions quite significantly. You can see in the graph the energy efficiency design index and the operational practices improvement, what reduction shipping can bring if they implement those regulations. And further to that, before I go to the slide, IMO has also started a comprehensive strategy for emission reduction, and it's work under progress. It is expected to be an initial strategy in 2018 by IMO and a revised strategy by 2023, and these discussions are very well under progress in IMO right now. But apart from those regulatory developments, one of the major challenge here is for the developing countries, especially the CITs and LDCs, who have the issue with the capacity right now, and also issues with the access to technologies and information. And that's where I would like to focus a bit more what IMO is doing in building the capacity in those countries. Of course, regulations are drivers. We have our own integrated technical cooperation program. It's not very big, but we are still trying to raise awareness. But we have embarked on some major projects, which I'll tell in a minute. And again, we are trying to move towards developing networks, and you have seen the CTCN equivalents. So we are trying to create global networks, and they can cooperate and share information together, and in some way we can institutionalize this network around the world and then collectively address this issue. So that's the pathway IMO is taking, and this is the first project that we're implementing with the GEF support. We have some 10 countries participating. And some of the countries, India, China, Malaysia, Panama, South Africa, Georgia, Argentina, those countries are participating. And the main aim there is legal, policy, and institutional reforms, how to domesticate the existing IMO convention into the national legislation, and also how to build the capacity. So that's efforts going on in the GLOME project. And we have also, this is a very exciting initiative, and we are all excited about this, the Global Industry Alliance that we were able to formulate under this project. There's a common interest from many technology players, ship owners, port operators to come together around a table, bring money to the table, and identify common solutions. So that's happening right now. We launched it last year with 16 members, and a lot of new interests are coming, big players to join hands to come around a table, and that's a very exciting, and some of the names are very familiar to many of you, and we hope it will continue to be bigger in the future. And another initiative, as I said, we are moving to more creating networks around the world. And this is the Global Maritime Technology Cooperation Center Network, which is, we got the inspiration from the CTCN and the UNFCCC, but there was nothing in the maritime sphere equivalent to that, so we wanted to create that, and the European Union came with a 10 million euro funding to create that network. Of course, I don't think anybody doubt the power of network and how these networks can actually bring some exponential improvement in capacity building. The vision is that we create these regional centers of excellence around the world, to start with a few, and then they could then create those satellite centers where capacity building can be done by the centers, technology cooperation can be facilitated, technology transfer can be facilitated, and that's what we are aiming at, these technology centers becoming the regional centers of excellence. We have already established in the last year 5 of the centers around the world. You would see those centers: Caribbean, in Trinidad, in Africa, and Kenya. In Asia, it's in China. In Fiji, in Pacific, it's in Fiji, and in Latin America, in Panama. And these are funded by the project right now, but we expect them to be self-running after a few years. But they're doing some exciting jobs there: capacity building, some technology demonstration projects, and also some data collection project. In summarizing, if you look into SDGs, of course, SDGs 14, which is very close to our heart here, is also close to us. But if you look into shipping, there's no SDGs that is actually not connected to international maritime transport, because we do move 90% of the world trade, so it has an impact on and influence on and all those SDGs. And with that, let me conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jose. So, you know, with the emissions struggle, and also with the natural feedbacks in the climate system, the system is keeping is getting warmer, no matter what is happening with the emissions, and this is a natural process because natural feedbacks are coming into play. This really means that we need vigorous mitigation, but adaptation is absolutely necessary. And Manuel Baranj, who is working for the Food and Agricultural Organization of United Nations, FAO, is going to give us some examples of adaptation solutions. The floor is yours, Manuel.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. Thank you, everyone, for staying here until the bitter end. And I'm going to deviate fundamentally from what I had in my presentation, because first of all, I want to introduce you the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room are people. I don't know if you've noticed, but I have noticed that in the majority of the presentations that you've had so far, people were intimated but not explicitly included. It was the impacts of people rather than them themselves. Now I'm going to tell you something a bit more personal. I still am an active scientist, and I am a climate change scientist. I used to build models, ecosystem models of the oceans, models of fish production and fish extraction, and so and so. And then I made one terrible mistake, and that mistake was to incorporate people into the models, to bring them and see what the social and economic side of the use of the oceans make into the models. And what I realized is that actually humans magnify or minimize the impact of climate change to incredible levels. So I decided to go and move to work for FAO, because we as humans we are very incredibly successful as a species, one of the most successful species ever, but we have one fundamental flaw, and that's what we need to eat. And we need to eat normally, sometimes 3 times a day. And that means that the 7.5 billion now and the 9.5 billion in a few decades need to eat, and food needs to be produced. And so how do we square that with the fact that our environment is changing and our production systems are changing on land and on ocean? And every country that comes to FAO, and the majority are actually developing countries, knock on our door and says, how do I feed my people and how do I feed them in the next few decades when the number increases? And that sharpens your thought quite a bit. There's the people, right? Now you have it explicit. This is a drawing from one of our scientists actually in FAO, a lady called Anna Menezes. I'm not going to describe the importance of fisheries. Everyone knows it. You have it in there, but I'll move very quickly. One thing that we know about climate change when it comes to the oceans, this is an iconic figure from the IPCC, is when it comes to the impacts of climate change on global fisheries, the majority of the impacts are in that band that I closed in that rectangle. In the tropical zones, we expect a decrease in global production. In other areas, not so much. Now, it so happens that this is also the area that will see an increase in number of population, human population, more than any other area, right? So that's where things hit things. And you need to find solutions. And the only solution in this case is to try to work with countries in designing adaptations. How are they going to cope with this so that they improve their situation? Now, in the FAO, we came up with this triad for adaptation. Is that if we need to adapt, you need to decide what, when, and how. And for that, you need to adapt at 3 levels. First, the institutional and the management. From the governance to the actual practical elements of how do you manage a resource that you extract and you make use of. The second is livelihoods. How do you actually help the people on the ground that really depend on those resources to diversify the livelihoods or to modify it so that do not end up stranded? And third, how do you manage risk to reduce it, and how do you manage resilience to increase it in ways that help the other 2 adaptation strategies? So if you keep that framework in mind, the next level is to start breaking this down into, well, what type of institutional management adaptations do you need? From the planning, from management principles, starting with the ecosystem approach to fisheries, which is the cornerstone, the Bible of FAO. Moving into management measures specifically. Then into the livelihoods. How do you actually change, improve the livelihoods within the sector and then between sectors? How do you build up resilience and how do you reduce risk? By pooling that risk, by developing early warning systems, by getting prevention measures and preparedness and responses. And each one of these has a long list of potential areas of work for adaptation. And each one of those form essentially altogether the toolbox for adaptation. Now, the vision that we have at FAO is that this we will continue to develop over the next few months in order to be able to provide this almost like the toolbox for the countries, that every country that comes to FAO and says, I have a problem, we can say to them, okay, what are your objectives? What are your strategies? What is that you care for in terms of providing food to your people? And then find the right tools in that toolbox that fits with their needs. Roll that through the countries that need it, and that provides at least a coordinated and considerate adaptation process. We are rolling this toolbox to a number of projects. We have a FAO GEF adaptation program with activities in Chile over the next 2 years, in the Eastern Caribbean, also still running until 2019, in the Benguela system until 2020, in Malawi, not an ocean state, but many of these adaptation toolboxes are applied to any aquatic system. In Bangladesh, also until 2020, and in Myanmar, again, until 2020. Test that road test these toolboxes. Until then, we are able to make them more widely available so that people can actually use it for that right reason, which is how do we feed the world in 2050? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And I think we represent here 8 organizations of United Nations UN Oceans, but there are 23. So we didn't give justice to them, but it's impossible now to review what is the rest of the group is doing. But I think I also didn't give justice to my own organization, in the Climate and Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. So just maybe in 1 minute I will try to summarize what we do. When we speak, and particularly when in the United Nations arena, people say that 93% of ocean heat, extra ocean heat, goes to the ocean. Well, someone has to measure this, and this is exactly what comes from the Global Ocean Observing System that is led by IUC of UNESCO. So with observations, then we have to process data, turn this into information, provide this information to research. And then, on the basis of this research and data, we have to provide different services, like, for example, tsunami warning system, harm from algal bloom predictions, and many other predictions. This requires operational services. In addition to this, of course, we have to inform the policy. That would be take form as assessment or some information for governance. And governance is taking place on different levels. Also, this has to be done on global level and regional level. So we also work in the regions. So I think this is a huge work, and it really underpins the whole gamma of activities of UN oceans and the whole world. So ocean is really, it needs to be monitored, and the current support for global ocean observation system and many other systems remains voluntary. We don't have a system that really requires countries to make the support. There is understanding, but this is not legally binding. So with that, I would like now to underline that we really need to do a lot to save the ocean, to help ocean to save climate, and these two things are really connected. And I think this year we have been witnessing a change in this arena that was related also to the fact that there is no governance decision when it comes to protection of the ocean. It all comes from commitments of people who understand what is happening in the ocean. And the person next to me was incredibly instrumental in getting this understanding and commitment from the whole world. So my distinct pleasure to give the floor now to Ambassador Peter Thomson, UN Envoy, United Nations Secretary General Envoy on the Oceans.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vladimir. Manuel said that we'd got to the bitter end. Well, you know, I'm the bitter end, but I'll try not to be bitter, because my wife hits me with a frying pan when I just, you know, talk about what's going wrong in the world. And of course, the ocean is where so much of what is going wrong is happening. She says you have to speak, because I'm a grandfather, and we have to speak to our grandchildren about what's going on. We have to speak about solutions, and we have to speak about positive action and implementation. And so I repeat what I've been saying over and over in the last couple of days. We have a plan to save the ocean, and it's SDG 14. This is a universal plan. All of us are committed to it, because all of our leaders in September 2015 adopted it. So that's the good news. Then what are we going to do about it? Okay, I've been appointed as a special envoy, as you know. They say that you should be able to encapsulate your strategy on the back of an envelope. You know, all the best deals that were ever made were on the back of an envelope. I did this little sketch here, and I'll share it with you, because this will enable you to see what a simple mind I have. That was basically 3 a.m. one morning on these aeroplanes that have become my home now, as I travel the world selling SDG 14. Basically, that's a trident. The fish down the bottom there, that's the 2017 conference. We've had that. It's been grilled, and it was good, because it was the tipping point in global consciousness about ocean action. The fact that we're all in this, ocean change is happening, and we got from that global conference 1,400 voluntary commitments, which we're now building on. We got that wonderful call for action which was subsequently adopted by consensus in the General Assembly, by consensus, imagine, because it's such a strong document, that call for action. It took 4 months of intense negotiation between the member states of the United Nations to agree on that. We got that. Then we at that conference, remember, we assembled the best ocean experts in the world to find solutions to the problems in those 7 partnership dialogues. So there was an awful lot that came out of that fish that we grilled back in June 2017. That trident, is pointing at 2020. I want to really get it into everybody's heads that we're in a 3-year cycle here, that in 3 years' time we're going to be held accountable for what we've done in the intervening 3 years. We are going to have that moment where we assess, you know, where are we at in our relationship with the ocean? What do we need to do to adjust? You know, what are our successes and failures? Because at 2020, two things. Firstly, there'll only be one more decade left to implement SDG 14, our plan to save the ocean. Thankfully, we'll have good science, because that's going to be the decade of International Decade of Marine Science, which IOC is leading. But we'll only have that one decade, because if we get to 2030 and we have not implemented the 10 targets of SDG 14, I don't know what I can tell my grandchildren. There is no message of hope if we haven't implemented SDG 14. But we will. That's the good thing. We're going to do this. We're all in on this now. Ocean action is now as big as climate action in people's minds, and implementation is starting. So that trident there is aimed at 2020, because that's the moment that our next really big global accountability moment is 2020. I know it hasn't been mandated yet by the United Nations, but you know, the first one wasn't mandated. We got it done, right? You get these things done. It's just a process. And you know, the great majority of member states of the United Nations have already told me that they're going to get this thing mandated. So, 3 years, everybody get ready. Do what you have to do, because you're going to be held accountable in 3 years' time. That trident, the central thing there is the activation of what came out of the 2017 Ocean Conference, those 1,400 voluntary commitments, and how you probably heard me speaking in the other room, how we're forming these 9 communities of ocean action, which are being launched at the end of this month in New York at the United Nations. So I'm spending 4 days launching those in global webinars. You know, a community of ocean action on ocean acidification, another one on corals, another one on mangroves, another one on sustainable blue economy, another one on sustainable fisheries, another one on ocean governance, another one on marine science. There's 9 of them all together. They will take those 1,400 voluntary commitments through to 2020. They'll be where we were getting action. Why? Because everybody who made one of those voluntary commitments is getting invited into those communities of ocean action. And if once they're in there, they're going to know half a dozen of their mates or fellow institutions around the world who should also be in that particular community of action. So those communities of ocean action are going to grow rapidly over the next 3 years. And to get into the community of ocean action, all you have to do is make a voluntary commitment on the UN website, and you're in. So those voluntary commitments are also going to grow between now and 2020. What's the idea of all this? The idea is to get everybody involved, you know, to be as inclusive as possible. As I was saying in that meeting through there, you hear about this multitude of organizations and processes and work streams and all the rest. Don't be put off by that, because you need to hear about, you know, 10,000 more of those if we're going to do the job of saving the ocean for our grandchildren. Now, every human being has to be part of this, just as every human being now has woken up on climate change. Everybody's got to wake up on ocean change as well. Otherwise, there'll be no oxygen for our grandchildren to breathe if we let the ocean die. So that central point of the trident is those communities of ocean action. And my office and UNDESA, which is the biggest department in the United Nations, which is also a member of UN Oceans, we're driving that. And we'll take that through over the next 3 years. The other trident point here is that great community that came together at the 2017 conference, which was science and which was private enterprise, you know, the businesses, fishing companies and tourist companies and so on, the civil society, the non-governmental organizations, that huge community of energy and ideas and resources that came together and showed their commitment in June. We don't want that to dissipate. We don't want them to think, oh, we just got you together and then, you know, you go back to where you came from. Not at all. So I'm not in a position to announce what we're doing on that, but let me tell you that trident there is well advanced, and something will be hitting your airwaves I would say within 2 months, you will see what that is. And I'm very excited about that one. And Isabella Lövin, the Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden, and I concluding our work on this next week when she's here. She, as you know, was co-president with Fiji of the 2017 conference. And so we're carrying that through, that co-presidency work, our commitment. So that inclusiveness for the non-governmental sector is that trident. The other part of the trident here is UN Oceans. And that's what we're here to talk about here tonight. And that is such an important part of it. I mean, what is the United Nations? The United Nations, you know, is us in the sense that, you know, it belongs to everybody. But we've appointed people, many of whom are sitting up here well, all of us sitting up here, who are, you know, representatives of humanity, but who are bureaucrats. We're doing the bureaucratic work for humanity. You know, whether we're in FAO or whether we're in UNEP or IOC, we're the bureaucrats. They're actually doing what the governments have told us all needs being done, right? So that's us. So we have to hold our end up. We have to get to 2020 really proud of what the UN system, I thought it was 20, it's 23, is it? What? The members of
23.
23, these 23 elements of the UN system, which are departments and which are programs of the UN and which are agencies of the UN and so on. They all come together in this UN Oceans mechanism that we've got, which is, by the way, currently being reviewed by member states to bring it up to date because its mandate actually predates SDG 14, so that has obviously to be incorporated in there. Anyway, we want to make sure that as we advance into 2018 and 2019, that the UN system is doing the very best it can in terms of delivery on SDG 14. That's my wish for UN Oceans. And I'm prepared to work with UN Oceans in any way I can to make sure that when 2020 comes around, we show up with great pride in what the UN system has delivered in the intervening 3 years. And why is that important? UN Oceans is represented in every country in the world. It's a huge army of bureaucrats who are out there. And we should all be delivering on what we are charged to do. So that's why UN Oceans is that third part of that trident of that strategy. And I'm very, very confident that UN Oceans is going to be a huge part of the success that we are going to achieve in implementing SDG 14 and saving the ocean. I have no doubt that UN Oceans will play a very strong role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. But I don't think that bureaucrat is a bad word. It's just a person who sits in office and works. This is what we do, and hope it really helps. You know, this brings me also to a quote from Manuel Barangji, because he spoke about food. Now I think it's the time for food, but I hope you have had enough food for thought. If you have just one burning question that is really jumping out of you, and you cannot just help by saying it, yeah, please do. So I think everything was understood well. Thank you very much for coming this late hour. So we will achieve what we would like to achieve. The ocean will help climate, and climate will help us to survive. Thank you.
Bravo. Excellent. Hey, we are.